Snow fell thick and merciless, swallowing the forest in silence. A female police officer was buried beneath the frozen ground, hands bound, body trapped, only her head left above the snow to die slowly, breath by breath. No sirens, no radios, no hope. Then crunching footsteps cut through the storm. A retired veteran pushed into the whiteout, his worn brown leather jacket crusted with ice. Beside him ran a German shepherd, focused, urgent, nose low, like it could smell fate. The dog stopped. Ears snapped forward, one sharp bark, then frantic digging. The veteran's light swept the ground, and found a face staring up from the snow. He tore into the ice with bare hands. The dog clawed like his life depended on it. They pulled her free alive, but her first words weren't "catch him." They were, "Don't. He thinks I killed his wife." Because this wasn't just hatred, it was grief aimed like a weapon. And someone in this town has been disguising murders as accidents for years. What happened next shocked everyone. Before we begin, hit like and subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. Snow fell in thick, merciless sheets, stuffing the pine forest with silence until even the wind sounded like it was whispering secrets through clenched teeth. Briar Hollow sat beyond the tree line, warm lights far away, as unreachable as mercy. Caleb Ward moved through the drifts like a man who had once learned how to disappear. 38, broad-shouldered, weathered in the face the way old maps are weathered, creased at the edges, burned in places, still readable if you knew the language. A scruff of beard darkened his jaw, and his hair, brown, gone a little lighter at the temples, was cut short because long hair had no place in a life where sleep came in pieces. Over his red and black plaid shirt, he wore a worn brown leather jacket, scuffed at the seams, the kind of jacket that looked like it had taken punches meant for the man inside. He wasn't a talker in town, not anymore. People said retired army, or back from overseas, the way they said bad storm coming, careful and vague. They didn't know the details, and Caleb preferred it that way. Details were the small stones you tripped on when you tried to walk forward. Beside him padded Bishop, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a black saddle and tan legs, thick winter coat dusted white, eyes amber brown and bright as lanterns in a ruin. Bishop had the disciplined gait of a working dog even when he was off duty, head slightly low, ears constantly reading the world, paws placing themselves with deliberate quiet. He wasn't a police K-9, not officially. Caleb had taken him in after a handler died, and a department quietly reassigned the dog to nowhere. Bishop had arrived with old scars beneath the fur and a habit of waking up snarling at shadows. He and Caleb understood each other in that wordless way of two survivors who didn't trust mornings until they arrived. Tonight, Caleb's breath smoked out in harsh bursts, and every exhale felt like he was paying rent to winter. He'd told himself he was only checking the snare line, only doing what he always did when the storms came. Make sure the cabin would eat tomorrow, make sure Bishop had a job, make sure his own head didn't get too loud. But the forest had its own plans. Bishop stopped so sharply Caleb nearly bumped him. The dog's body went rigid, tail stiff, ears snapping forward as if a distant god had spoken a command only he could hear. Caleb followed the dog's stare into a patch of snow that looked, at first glance, like every other patch of snow. Smooth, untouched, innocent. The kind of innocence that made trained men nervous. "What is it, Bishop?" Caleb murmured, voice low, because loud voices belonged to people who still believed the world listened kindly. Bishop didn't look back. His nose worked the air, fast and urgent, then he let out a sound that wasn't a bark and wasn't a whine, something between warning and grief. Caleb felt it in his ribs. The same sensation he used to get when a patrol went too quiet. Bishop lunged forward and began digging. Snow flew in heavy clumps. The dog's paws worked with frantic precision, not playful, not curious, desperate. Caleb's first thought was, a deer, a rabbit, something caught. Then the second thought, colder and sharper, arrived. Not an animal. Something about Bishop's posture said this wasn't prey. This was a rescue. Easy, Caleb said, though he didn't know who he was talking to, Bishop himself, or the unseen thing beneath the white. He dropped to his knees, leather creaking, and shoved his gloved hands into the hole Bishop was tearing open. The snow was packed tight, layered, like someone had pressed it down on purpose. Caleb's stomach tightened. In war, you learned the difference between the earth that had settled naturally and the earth that had been disturbed by human intent. Winter had become a blanket here, and someone had used it like a shovel. Bishop dug deeper, then stopped and thrust his muzzle into the cavity, going still. A tremor ran through him. Caleb leaned in, the flashlight beam shaking slightly as it cut into the hole. He saw a smear of dark fabric, a sleeve, a shoulder, and then, like the forest unveiling a cruelty it had been forced to hide, a face emerged, half buried, rimmed with frost, lashes clumped with ice. A young woman's eyes blinked open, sluggish but alive, irises a sharp winter gray that refused to soften even as her lips trembled blue. Her skin was pale under the crusted snow, cheeks chapped raw, strands of dark brown hair plastered to her forehead. She looked about 32, athletic in build from what Caleb could see, neck and shoulders strong, posture stubborn even while pinned. A strip of tape clung to the corner of her mouth like the last insult. Caleb's heart punched hard once. He'd seen men buried by avalanches. He'd seen bodies pulled out too late. This was different. This was personal. This was a message. Hey, stay with me," Caleb said, and something in his voice broke through the years of practiced calm. Bishop barked once, sharp and commanding, then resumed digging around her head, careful now, like a surgeon with claws. The woman's gaze flicked to Bishop, then to Caleb's face, as if trying to decide whether this was salvation or another hallucination sent by hypothermia. Her breath rasped out. "Police," she tried, and the word came out like broken glass. Caleb swept the flashlight across her exposed neck and saw the edge of a uniform collar under the snow, dark fabric stiff with frost. He dug with both hands, ripping his gloves on ice crystals, and found more tape at her wrists as he cleared a path down her shoulders. His fingers ached, skin burning with cold. He didn't stop. He couldn't. There was a strange, almost mythic fury in him, like some old guardian spirit had finally been given a task again. Bishop's growl rumbled low, not at the woman, but at the invisible hand that had put her here. Caleb freed one shoulder, then the other. Then he wedged his arms beneath her and pulled. The snow resisted like it wanted to keep its secret. The woman cried out, more shock than sound, and then her body slid upward in a stiff, shuddering release. Caleb hauled her onto the surface, rolling her onto a patch of cleared snow. Her legs were numb and slow to obey, boots half buried, and her hands were bound with zip ties, skin around them raw and swollen. Caleb's face tightened. He'd seen this kind of binding used by men who wanted you helpless, but present enough to understand your helplessness. "Name," Caleb demanded gently, because focusing on facts kept panic from biting. The woman blinked hard. "Megan," she whispered. "Megan Holt." Even in that whisper there was authority, a cop's habit of stating truth like it was a badge. Caleb studied her for 2 fast seconds. The straight line of her nose, the tense jaw, the small scars at her knuckles, suggesting she'd spent time fighting and not just writing reports. She wasn't a delicate person. She was a person who had learned to keep going. "Caleb Ward," he said. "This is Bishop. You're safe for now." Bishop pressed his muzzle against Megan's cheek, warm breath puffing, and she flinched at first. Then her eyes softened a fraction, the way they might soften for a faithful thing in a faithless world. Caleb reached for his knife and cut the zip ties. Megan's hands fell apart, trembling violently. She tried to flex her fingers and winced. Caleb tore open a thermal blanket from his pack. He always carried one, because storms didn't care about optimism, and wrapped her shoulders. "How long?" he asked. Megan swallowed, throat working painfully. "Hours," she rasped. He left me like this." "Who?" Caleb's jaw clenched, anger blooming hot enough to offend the cold. Megan's eyes drifted toward the trees as if she expected the forest itself to answer. "Ethan Cross," she said, and Caleb recognized the name the way you recognize a distant thunder something you've heard about. even if it hasn't hit your roof yet. In town, Ethan was spoken of in lowered voices. A 40-year-old former timber crew boss with a heavy build and a beard that made him look older than he was, a man whose grief had hollowed him out and then filled the hollow with rage. They said his wife, Claire, died in an accident last winter, and afterward Ethan stopped laughing entirely, stopped coming to diners, stopped being a neighbor, and became a roomer walking on boots. "He thinks I killed his wife," Megan added, and her voice shook. Not with fear now, but with something more complicated, something that sounded like understanding, fighting against pain. Caleb stared at her. "He buried you alive." "He buried me to make a point," Megan said, and she coughed harsh and wet, and, "He wants me to freeze the way he believes she froze." She tried to sit up, stubborn as a soldier, and Caleb steadied her. Bishop whined and nudged her shoulder like he was scolding her for moving too fast. For a second, Megan's mouth twitched, the ghost of humor. "Good dog," she murmured, voice softening despite herself. That small softness hit Caleb harder than he expected. It reminded him that people weren't only made of fear and rage, they were also made of tiny mercies. "We need to get you inside," Caleb said. "Cabin's a mile out." Megan's eyes sharpened. "No," she whispered, and it came out with the same force as a shouted order. Caleb paused. "No?" "Don't go after him," Megan said, breath trembling. "Not like that. Not angry. Not now." Caleb's brow furrowed. The storm hissed around them. Bishop stood guard, scanning the trees. Megan swallowed again, and in her face Caleb saw not just a victim, but a woman carrying a burden she'd been carrying long before the snow tried to finish her. "You don't understand," Megan said, and her voice dipped into something raw. "He has a reason to suspect. I've suspected something too. There have been deaths in Briar Hollow, too many accidents, too neat, too clean. I was looking for proof. Ethan thinks I'm the devil because someone fed him that story. If you storm after him, you become the proof he needs." Caleb's hands tightened into fists, then relaxed with visible effort. He knew that feeling, wanting to chase the monster and realizing the chase could turn you into one. In some older tale, a warrior would charge, sword raised, and the gods would clap. In real life, the gods mostly watched, bored and silent, while people bled. Megan's lashes fluttered. She was exhausted, shaking hard now as the adrenaline drained. "Please," she whispered, and the word was barely there. "Don't make him die inside again." Caleb looked at her, baffled by her compassion. "He tried to kill you," he said. Megan's gray eyes held his. "And he lost his wife," she answered, voice cracked. "If he's wrong, he's already buried himself alive." That line landed in Caleb's chest like a stone. Love and loss, he thought, were two wolves in the same forest, one teaching you to protect, the other teaching you to bite. People chose which one to feed. Bishop leaned into Caleb's leg, grounding him. Caleb exhaled slowly, visible breath curling like smoke from an altar. "Okay," he said at last, the word tasting like discipline. "First we keep you alive, then we do this the right way." Megan's eyes closed for 1 second relief, or maybe just the body surrendering. Caleb lifted her carefully, her weight light from cold and fatigue, and began the slow trek toward his cabin, Bishop pacing close, occasionally darting ahead to check the path. Behind them, the disturbed snow and the empty hole looked like a mouth that had tried to swallow a life and failed. Ahead, the storm waited with more questions. And by the time Caleb's cabin light finally cut through the trees, 3 truths had already been carved into the night. A veteran and his dog had refused to walk past a buried soul. A police officer had been left to die by a man blinded by grief. And Briar Hollow's winter was hiding something far worse than weather, something that dressed murder in the clean white costume of accident. The cabin light was a weak amber eye in a world of white rage. Caleb Ward kicked the door shut with his boot and leaned his shoulder into it until the latch caught, as if the storm were a living thing that might shove its way inside. Snow slid off his worn brown leather jacket in heavy clumps, melting into dark patches along the seams. Bishop shook himself hard, sending a spray of ice across the plank floor, then immediately pivoted back to the woman Caleb carried, because even out of the blizzard, his mind stayed on the mission. Megan Holt's body was stiff with cold, her limbs reluctant to remember they belonged to her. Caleb set her down on the couch near the wood stove, gentle but efficient, the way he'd once handled wounded men who hated being treated like they were fragile. The stove gave off a steady heat that smelled of pine resin and old smoke. It was the closest thing Caleb had to a hearth deity, the kind that didn't demand prayers-only chopped wood. Megan's face was still chalky beneath the thawing frost, lips cracked, eyelashes clumped, hair a dark brown tangle flattening against her skull as it warmed. Even half-dead, she held herself like a person trained to keep her spine straight. The sort of woman who'd learned that collapsing was a luxury. She tried to sit up. Her shoulders trembled. "Don't move too much," Caleb said. His voice had that quiet command men learned when shouting stopped working. He grabbed a wool blanket from the chair and layered it over her thermal wrap. Then he poured water into a chipped kettle and set it on the stove. "Small sips. You shock your system, you'll pass out." Megan's eyes narrowed, not in defiance, but in the stubborn habit of measuring people. "You talk like a medic," she rasped. Caleb's mouth twitched humor, thin as paper. "I learned from watching them, and from making mistakes I don't want to repeat." Bishop hopped onto the rug and laid down close to the couch, his thick black and tan coat rising and falling with controlled breaths. His amber-brown eyes never left Megan's face, as if he could keep her alive by staring hard enough. Megan's fingers shook as she tried to flex them. The skin around her wrists was raw, a red ring of pain where the zip ties had bitten. Caleb dug in a drawer and found a small tin of salve. He crouched beside her, his knees cracking softly, and dabbed it on with careful hands. His knuckles were scraped, bleeding in shallow lines, payment for tearing her out of winter's mouth. Megan watched him do it. "You didn't have to," she whispered. Caleb didn't look up. "Yeah," he said. "I did." The kettle began to murmur. Outside, the blizzard scraped its nails along the cabin walls, furious at losing its prey. Inside, the air held a different tension, one that didn't come from weather. Megan's eyes kept drifting to the window, as if she expected the trees to carry Ethan Cross to her doorstep. Caleb noticed. "He won't come here," Megan said, voice strained. "Not tonight. He already decided I was finished." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "From the beginning. Not the part you think I want. The part I need." Megan swallowed, throat working like sandpaper. She was a woman in her early 30s, athletic but not bulky lean strength, the kind built by long shifts and stubbornness. Her skin, normally likely sun-warmed from patrols, now looked bloodless under the lamplight. Her eyes, a sharp winter gray, were the only part of her that seemed fully awake. "Ethan Cross," she began, and the name filled the cabin like smoke. 40 years old, works timber jobs when anyone will hire him. Most won't, not anymore. She closed her eyes a moment, remembering. He used to be normal, loud laugh. The kind of guy who'd shovel his neighbor's driveway without being asked. Her mouth tightened. Then Claire died. Caleb had heard bits of that story in town, like everyone else. Claire Cross, school volunteer, gentle voice, always wearing a knitted hat in winter. Accident, the papers said. Slipped near the creek, people repeated, because repeating was easier than thinking. Megan opened her eyes again. After that, he became a different person, not violent in public, just hollowed out, like the warmth got scooped out of him. She paused, and Caleb watched her fight the tremor in her hands. Tonight I was following leads, quietly. I didn't radio it in. Caleb lifted an eyebrow. Why? Megan's gaze dropped. Because every time I tried to open certain doors, the paperwork vanished. Body cam footage got corrupted. The same names kept showing up, the same people telling me I was wasting resources. She exhaled a shaky breath. So I stopped telling them what I was doing. There was a mythic sadness in that confession, The lonely hero, the oracle nobody believed, the soldier walking into the dark without a chorus behind her. Caleb poured warm water into a mug, added a pinch of salt and sugar the way he'd been taught, and held it to her lips. Megan sipped, grimaced, but drank. "I went out near the closed service road," she continued. "There's a stretch of woods where the signal dies, where nobody hears you if you scream. I'd been there before because the accidents cluster around that area." Caleb leaned back slightly, listening with the stillness of a man who knew how stories turned into ambushes. "I saw him," Megan said. "Ethan. He was out there with a shovel and a headlamp. I thought he was, I don't know, digging for something, burying something." She laughed once, bitter and faint. "Turns out I wasn't wrong." Bishop's ears flicked at the word shovel. Caleb reached down and ran a hand along Bishop's neck, grounding himself. "I approached Ethan," Megan said. "Hands visible, announced myself. He didn't jump. He didn't even look surprised, like he'd been waiting." Her eyes flashed with the memory. "He said my name before I said it." Caleb's gaze sharpened. "How would he know your name?" Megan's throat bobbed. "That's what scared me." She took another sip. "He called me liar, said I wore a badge to hide what I'd done. I told him I didn't know what he meant. He said Claire's death wasn't an accident, and I helped cover it up." Caleb felt a slow, ugly chill crawl up his spine. In war, misinformation was a weapon. Here, in a small town, it was a rope with a polite smile. "I tried to talk him down," Megan said. "Told him I'd reopened her file privately. Told him I believed something was wrong too." Her lips pressed together. "But grief doesn't negotiate. It only collects interest." She looked at her wrists, the raw skin. He had zip ties ready, tape, a shovel, like he'd rehearsed it. Caleb's eyes narrowed at the details. Premeditation, preparation. That wasn't a man acting on sudden rage. That was a man pushed into a plan. "Did he have a gun?" Caleb asked. Megan shook her head slowly. "A knife and words. He didn't need a gun. He needed me to stop talking." She swallowed hard. "He told me I'd die the way she died. Cold, alone, unable to move, unable to explain." Caleb's hands curled. "But you said she froze." Megan hesitated. "That's the story he believes. That's the story someone fed him." Caleb stared at her. "Who?" Megan's eyes shifted to the dark corner of the cabin where Caleb kept his radio, turned off most nights because he didn't like voices interrupting his silence. "Harold Pike," she said. The name landed like a coin in a well. Harold Pike, deputy mayor, clean-cut, always in a crisp coat, smile practiced, handshake firm. A man who smelled faintly of aftershave and money. He sponsored holiday drives and spoke at memorials with wet eyes that never quite produced tears. In Briar Hollow, he was the kind of man people called solid. Megan's voice grew quieter. "Pike told Ethan I was involved, that I lost evidence, that I protected someone." She coughed, and Caleb heard a hint of anger buried under her compassion. "I asked Ethan where he got that. He wouldn't say, but he muttered Pike's name like it tasted like blood." Caleb leaned forward. "Do you have proof Pike is behind this?" Megan's gaze steadied. "Not yet, and that's the problem." She shifted, wincing, but the stubbornness returned to her eyes. "There have been deaths, Caleb, a lot of them. People who asked questions, people who filed complaints, people who got in the way of land deals and conservation projects. They all end up as accidents, slipped on ice, carbon monoxide, single-car rollover." She looked at him like she was asking him to believe in ghosts. "It's too neat." Caleb gave a humorless exhale. "Neat is never natural." Bishop lifted his head at that, as if agreeing. Megan continued, voice steadier now that warmth was returning. "I've been collecting small things, photos, timestamps, patterns, but someone keeps stepping ahead of me. Tonight, Ethan, he didn't just hate me. He was trying to make a point, to shut me up permanently." She pressed her lips together, then added, softer, And he's not evil. He's burned. Caleb studied her face, puzzled by her refusal to hate the man who tried to kill her. "Why defend him?" he asked. Megan's eyes glistened, not from tears, but from the ache of remembering. "Because I watched him at Claire's memorial," she whispered. "He couldn't stand. He just shook, like his body was trying to hold his soul in." Her jaw tightened. That kind of grief can turn a good man into a weapon. And weapons don't choose targets. Someone aims them. The cabin creaked as wind shoved it. For a moment, Caleb saw, like a flash of old footage, his own past. Commanders pointing, men moving, the way anger could be turned into a mission. He'd thought he'd left that behind, apparently warlike to follow. The kettle whistled. Caleb poured another mug, this time with weak tea. "Drink," he said. Megan complied, then exhaled. Her color was still poor, but her eyes were clearer. Bishop rose and placed his front paws gently on the couch edge, sniffing her face as if confirming she was still here. Megan's mouth flickered again, a fragile smile. "He's serious," she murmured. "He's the best kind," Caleb said, and something warm slipped into his voice despite his efforts. "He doesn't waste love." Megan's gaze lifted to Caleb's face. "You said your name is Ward," she said. "You from here?" Caleb shook his head once. "Not originally. Drifted in after I was done being useful to people who didn't know my name." Megan studied him, and for a heartbeat Caleb felt like he was under interrogation, except kinder. "Why stay?" Megan asked. Caleb's eyes went to the window. The forest outside was a blur of white. "Because the woods don't ask questions," he said, "and because Bishop needed somewhere to be more than a file on a desk." Megan nodded slowly, as if she understood the language of being discarded. Then her expression tightened. "We can't wait," she said suddenly. "Ethan will go home. He'll sit with his rage, and Pike or whoever will keep feeding it. If we don't reach Ethan first, someone else will." Caleb held her gaze. "You can barely sit up." Megan's jaw set. "I can think, and I can talk." She lifted her hands, trembling but functional. "That's what this is about. Talking Ethan back from the edge before he becomes the excuse they need." Caleb was silent a long moment. The humor of the universe wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years trying to forget how to plan operations, and now a half-frozen cop was dragging him into another one. Bishop padded closer and nudged Caleb's thigh, then looked toward the door, ears pricked. Not fear anticipation, like he already knew the next page was turning. Caleb finally nodded. "We do it smart," he said. "We don't go charging into the night like heroes in bad movies." Megan let out a breath she'd been holding. "Agreed." Caleb grabbed his old field notebook from a shelf dog-eared, stained, then slid it across the table. "Tell me everything you know about the other accidents," he said. "Names, dates, places." Megan stared at the notebook, then at him. "You're helping," she said, as if testing the truth. Caleb's expression was flat, but his eyes carried a weary vow. "I already did," he answered. "I pulled you out of the ground. Might as well find out who's been burying the town." Megan nodded, and in that nod a new alliance took shape. Strange, imperfect, stitched together by winter and guilt. Outside, the storm raged like an old god denied its sacrifice. Inside, warmth returned to Megan's skin, and purpose returned to Caleb's bones. Bishop lay between them like a living oath. In Briar Hollow, the snow was still falling, still pretending to be pure, still covering tracks. But it had failed to swallow one voice tonight. And somewhere out there, a man named Ethan Cross sat alone with cold ash in his lungs, believing a lie that was not entirely his. Dawn didn't arrive in Briar Hollow the way it did in kinder places. It seeped in, pale and cautious, as if even the sun was afraid of the forest's mood. The storm had eased into a steadier, fall-less screaming wind, more relentless white turning every pine into a bowed statue and every path into a blank page that kept trying to erase itself. Caleb Ward stood at his cabin window with a mug of bitter coffee cooling in his hand, watching the tree line the way a man watches a doorway he doesn't trust. The worn brown leather jacket still hung over a chair, damp at the shoulders from last night's fight with winter. Bishop sat beside the door, alert and quiet, tail tucked close, ears flicking at every creak of wood and distant crack of ice. Megan Holt was awake on the couch, wrapped in layers like a bundled secret. Color had returned to her cheeks, but it was a hard-earned color more stubborn than healthy. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her gray eyes looked brighter now, sharpened by the simple fact she'd survived. When she moved carefully, testing her body like a soldier testing a healed wound. "You should stay," Caleb said without turning around. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a man who'd learned that bravery didn't protect you from consequences. Megan's mouth tightened. "And let him spiral alone?" she answered. "That's how people become monsters." Caleb finally faced her. His face in daylight looked more carved than it had under lamplight high cheekbones, a strong nose, the kind of jaw that made people assume he was angry even when he was just thinking. The scruff of beard along his chin was darker now that it had dried. "He buried you," Caleb said. "He's already a monster." Megan shook her head slowly. "He's a man with a wound. Someone is pressing on it until he bleeds on the wrong people." Her voice softened, but it didn't weaken. "If we go after him like a posse, he'll run, or he'll shoot. If we find him like humans, we might get him to listen." Bishop rose, patted to Megan, and sniffed her hands. She flinched at first from the memory of bindings, then relaxed when his warm nose nudged her knuckles. She scratched behind his ear with stiff fingers, and Bishop leaned into it like he'd been waiting all night for permission to be gentle. Caleb watched the exchange and felt something twist in his chest, irritation mixed with reluctant admiration. The dog had a cleaner conscience than either of them. "Fine," Caleb said at last, "but we do it my way." Megan's brow lifted. "Which is?" "Quiet. Fast. No hero speeches," Caleb replied. Then, after a beat, he added with dry humor, "And if you fall over again, I'm charging you for medical services." Megan huffed a small laugh that turned into a cough. "Deal." They geared up in minutes. Caleb strapped on an old headlamp, slung a small pack with blankets, water, and a compact first aid kit. He clipped a long lead to Bishop's harness, not because Bishop needed it, but because storms loved to take good things without warning. Megan put on a thick parka she'd kept in her patrol truck, now draped over a chair to dry. She looked different in civilian winter gearless official, more human, but her posture still carried authority. Even with bruising shadows under her eyes, she moved like someone used to walking into danger and pretending she wasn't afraid. Before they left, Megan pulled a small evidence pouch from her pocket and placed it on Caleb's table like an offering. Inside were two tiny items, a torn strip of gray duct tape with a faint smear of dirt and a broken corner of a plastic zip tie. "I kept these," she said. "Ethan's prints might be on them, or someone else's." Caleb nodded once, impressed despite himself. "Good." He grabbed his weathered notebook and a pencil. "Tell me where he lives." Megan hesitated. "Not in town. He's got an old logging shed off Ridge Spur Trail, but I don't think he went there last night." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Why?" Megan glanced toward the forest. "Because he didn't look like a man going home. He looked like a man trying to disappear." Bishop whined softly, as if he agreed. Outside, the world was a white hush. They moved into it, boots crunching, breath rising in cloudy bursts. Bishop led, nose low, tracking the scent that still hung like invisible thread through the snow. Caleb followed a few paces behind, scanning the woods with the habit of someone who never stopped checking for angles. Megan stayed to his side, her steps a little uneven at first, then steadier as her body warmed. The trail they followed wasn't a neat line. Ethan's footprints stamped heavy, then shallow, then heavy again, like his mind had been switching between rage and regret. At one point the prince veered sharply, then doubled back, hesitation made visible. "He's fighting himself," Megan murmured. Caleb didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. Fighting yourself was the most exhausting war. The forest opened into a narrow corridor where pines stood close together, their branches sagging with snow. Wind brushed through them, sending powder down in small avalanches. Bishop stopped and sniffed a low branch. A faint streak of dark cloth clung to a twig, as if someone had snagged a sleeve in a hurry. Caleb reached up and plucked at free flannel, red and black plaid. Ethan's, most likely. Caleb's eyes flicked to Megan, then to his own shirt under the jacket. "Town's not big on originality," he muttered, and Megan's lips twitched. Humor was a candle. It didn't fix the cold, but it kept you from becoming it. After an hour they reached the place Megan had warned about, the creek. In summer it would have been a clear ribbon through the woods. In winter it was a frozen mirror, smooth and deceptively calm. The creek bank was ringed by old caution tape tied to stakes. Caleb's first instinct was to accept it as official. His second instinct, stronger, was to distrust anything that looked too tidy. He crouched and examined the tape. It was newer than it should have been. Bright yellow, less frayed, the knot tight and recent. "This was replaced," Caleb said. Megan's eyes sharpened. "It should be old," she murmured. "Claire died almost a year ago." Caleb moved along the bank. One stake had a faint gouge mark near its base, a long scrape like something heavy had been dragged past. He scraped away snow and found the wood fibers torn. "Something was pulled," he said. Bishop sniffed the gouge and growled low. Megan crouched, her breath hitching. "This is where they said she slipped," she whispered, as if repeating it might change the facts. Caleb shifted his headlamp beam across the ice. Near the edge, under a thin layer of snow crust, he saw a shallow scuff that didn't match the natural pattern of freeze. He knelt, pressed his gloved palm to the ice, and felt the faint unevenness. "Someone stood here," he said. "Recently?" Megan asked. Caleb shook his head. "Not recently, but not a year ago either. Ice renews. Marks like this don't last that long." Megan swallowed, her face tightening with vindication and dread. She pulled out her phone, even though there was no signal, and took photos anyway. "I've seen a pattern," she said quietly. "The accidents are always in places where the evidence can vanish. Water, fire, snow." Caleb's eyes lifted. "And the official story always fits too easily." Megan nodded. Bishop's ears snapped up. He turned his head, alert, staring toward the tree line as if he'd heard something. Caleb froze, hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Megan held her breath. A moment passed, heavy as stone. Then a soft soundwood creaking, or snow shifting under a boot. Bishop let out a warning growl. Caleb's gaze scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The forest held its face perfectly still. "We're not alone," Megan whispered. Caleb's mouth tightened. "We never are." They moved away from the creek with more urgency. Bishop led them along a narrow path that wasn't on any map, an old logging cut, half reclaimed by snow. Ethan's tracks reappeared here, sharper, deeper, as if he'd been walking faster. Then Caleb saw it, another set of footprints crossing the trail at an angle. Smaller steps, a narrower heel. The tread pattern crisp and deliberate. Not Ethan's heavy work boots. Not Megan's standard-issue patrol boots. "Stop," Caleb said softly. Megan leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Those aren't his," she murmured. Caleb pointed with his pencil tip, careful not to disturb the print. "See the heel? Sharp edge, lighter weight." He followed the tracks with his eyes. They went off toward the creek, then disappeared into fresh snowfall. Megan's expression cooled. "I've seen this tread before," she said, voice low. "At another accident. A man who died in a single-car crash on Dryden Road. The report said he swerved for a deer, but there were two sets of prints near the ditch." Caleb's eyes hardened. So whoever left these prints visited multiple scenes. Megan nodded once, and they walked right through a taped-off accident site like they owned it. Caleb exhaled through his nose, anger sharpening into focus. The enemy wasn't the grieving man with a shovel. The enemy was the person who had learned how to wear cleanliness like armor. Evening crept in early, as it always did in deep winter. The light turned bluish-gray, the kind that made everything look like it belonged to a dream. The storm thickened again. Wind picked up, scattering loose snow. Megan's steps slowed, fatigue creeping into her shoulders. Caleb noticed and adjusted their pace without comment, positioning himself slightly ahead to break the wind for her. Bishop kept moving, relentless. At last, through the trees, a dim glow appeared, weak, flickering. A small lean-to structure pressed against a rock outcrop, half buried in snow. Smoke threaded from a makeshift vent, thin and hungry. "That's him," Megan whispered. Caleb nodded. He raised a hand, signaling stillness. They approached carefully. Caleb could smell damp wood burning, the sharp scent of cheap whiskey, and beneath it, something else, cold ash, like a fire that had been stomped out too hard. As they reached the edge of the clearing, a shape moved inside the lean-to. A man stepped out holding a hunting rifle, barrel angled toward the ground but ready. Ethan Cross looked exactly like grief made flesh. He was tall, around 6 feet broad across the shoulders from a lifetime of physical work, but thinner now, as if sorrow had been eating him. His beard was thick and unkempt, black shot through with gray, and his eyes were bloodshot, ringed with sleeplessness. His cheeks were wind-burned, and his hands were raw, knuckles cracked. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who'd been living too long in the aftermath of a scream. When he saw Megan, his face tightened like a fist. The rifle lifted a fraction. "Stay back," he growled, voice rough. Bishop's body tensed, but he didn't lunge. He simply stood, ears forward, like a disciplined soldier awaiting orders. Caleb stepped forward slowly, palms visible. "Ethan," Caleb said, calm and firm. "Put it down." Ethan's gaze flicked to Caleb, then back to Megan, eyes flaring. "You brought her here," Ethan spat, and there was a tremor under the rage fear of being wrong. Megan took one step forward despite the shake in her legs. Her voice came out steady, almost gentle. "If I killed Claire," she said, "I wouldn't be standing here in front of your gun." Ethan's jaw clenched. Snow swirled around them like restless spirits. For a moment, the whole forest seemed to lean in to hear what would happen next. Caleb watched Ethan's finger near the trigger and knew this was not a standoff of cops and criminals. This was a mythic moment. A man at the cliff edge of his own story, deciding whether to step back into humanity or fall into the monster someone wanted him to become. The rifle trembled in Ethan Cross's hands, not from weakness, but from the kind of rage that had nowhere left to live except in bone. Snow swirled through the clearing like pale spirits circling a judgment. Caleb stood with his palms open, body angled slightly between Ethan and Megan. Not heroic, just practical, like a man who had learned that the safest place for a bullet was inside his own certainty. Bishop held still at Caleb's knee, muscles taut under his thick black and tan coat, ears forward, eyes locked on Ethan's trigger finger as if the dog could hypnotize it into mercy. Megan took another step forward, slow, deliberate, making sure her boots crunched loudly enough for Ethan to track her movement without panic. Her face was pale in the cold, but her eyes were steady winter gray, refusing to flinch. "Ethan," she said, and she didn't sound like a cop now. She sounded like a person speaking to another person across a burning bridge. "You wanted me to freeze the way you think she froze. I get that. But you don't actually want me dead. You want someone to admit the world was cruel to you." Ethan's jaw clenched. His beard, thick and unkempt, glistened with melting snow along the gray strands. His cheeks were chapped raw, and his eyes looked bloodshot, sleep-starved, haunted by images he replayed until they became his religion. "Don't say her name like you knew her," he spat. Megan didn't blink. "I knew the file," she answered quietly. And the file is wrong. The words hit the clearing with a strange weight. Ethan's rifle dipped a fraction, then lifted again as if his hands couldn't decide what the truth demanded. Caleb spoke, low and controlled. "Ethan, let us inside. Out of the wind. You can keep the gun. Just point it at the floor." Ethan's eyes flicked to Caleb, assessing the broad shoulders, the worn jacket, the calm that didn't come from arrogance, but from experience. "Who are you?" Ethan growled. Caleb's expression stayed flat. "A man who's tired of watching grief make fools of good people," he said. That landed somewhere deep in Ethan's chest because the rifle finally lowered. Not all the way, just enough to show the fight in him had shifted from attack to survival. "Fine," Ethan muttered, voice thick. He jerked his head toward the lean-to. "Move. Slow." They entered the shelter. It wasn't much more than salvaged boards and tarp pressed against a rock outcrop, but inside a small stove burned with damp wood, casting a flickering orange glow that made every face look like it belonged to an old painting. Saints and sinners gathered in the same frame. The air smelled of smoke, wet wool, and cheap whiskey. A half-empty bottle sat near a crate, its label peeled, like even the alcohol wanted to forget where it came from. Ethan kept the rifle in his lap as he sat on a crate, shoulders hunched. In the firelight, the lines in his face looked deeper. 40 years old, built like a timberman, but carrying an extra decade of exhaustion. Megan sat on an overturned bucket near the stove, careful with her bruised limbs, and Caleb stayed standing, back against the wall, eyes moving constantly. Bishop lay down between them, a quiet barrier of fur and vigilance, head up, watching every breath. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The storm rattled the tarp like impatient fingers. Then Megan broke the silence with a question that didn't accuse. "Tell me about Claire," she said. Ethan's eyes flashed. "Why?" "Because if someone took her from you," Megan replied, "you deserve to know who, not who someone told you, who actually did it." Ethan swallowed hard. The anger in him was still there, but now it was mixed with something worse. Hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable. Ethan stared into the stove, jaw working. "Claire," he began, and his voice cracked so hard he had to stop. He rubbed a hand over his face like he could wipe away memory. She was the kind of woman who made coffee for strangers. That's how she was. She'd see someone cold and act like warmth was her job. His eyes glistened, and he looked away as if ashamed of tears. She was small, 5'4" maybe. Not fragile, just compact. Dark hair always in a loose braid. Skin that burned easy in summer. Freckles across her nose. She laughed loud when she was really happy, like she didn't care who heard. Ethan's lips tightened. She kept lists. She believed if you wrote something down, it couldn't slip away. Megan's throat tightened. Caleb didn't move, but his gaze softened a fraction. The words coming faster now, like a dam giving. She was checking land boundaries for a survey group contract work. They were talking about rezoning chunks of forest. Development, they called it. Like that word makes it clean. Ethan's hand gripped the rifle stock until his knuckles whitened. Claire started saying things didn't add up. She found markers moved, paperwork that didn't match what was on the ground. She said somebody was stealing the forest with a pen. Megan leaned forward slightly. "The day she died," Ethan said, "she called me. Her voice, it was different. Not scared like a movie scared. Scared like she'd finally seen the teeth behind the smile." He swallowed. She said, "Ethan, there's something here that shouldn't exist." That's the exact phrase, like she was talking about a creature. His eyes lifted, wild in the firelight. She said powerful people were involved. People in town who smile at funerals. Then she said she couldn't talk on the phone. She said she'd come home and show me. Ethan's laugh was bitter. She never came home. Megan's face tightened. "The report said she slipped into the creek," she said quietly. Ethan's shoulders shook once. "Yeah," he whispered. "Slipped. Just conveniently slipped. In boots with tread meant to grip ice. In daylight, with no broken branches, no signs of a struggle, no nothing, just a neat story. He stared at Megan with raw fury. And then, 2 days later, Harold Pike shows up at my door. Caleb's eyes narrowed. There it was, the name again, circling like a vulture that pretended to be a dove. Ethan's voice grew low, poisonous. Pike came in like he was doing me a favor. Clean coat, perfect hair. That smile that tells you he's already decided what you are. Ethan's gaze unfocused, remembering. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said the town would take care of things. Then he said the investigation was complicated. He said evidence was missing. Ethan's jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. He told me Megan Holt was the one who handled the scene. He told me you... Ethan jabbed the rifle slightly toward Megan, not aiming, but accusing. You covered for someone. That you erased what really happened. Megan went very still. In the firelight, she looked like a statue trying not to crack. He told you that, she whispered. Ethan nodded once, eyes blazing. He said it like it was fact, like I should be grateful he was telling me the truth. He said if I wanted justice, I'd have to take it, because the system was compromised. Ethan's breath came harsh. He planted that idea in my skull like a nail. Megan's hands curled in her lap, trembling. I've suspected Pike, she said, for months. Ethan's eyes widened, anger flickering into confusion. Megan forced the words out, steady but heavy. Files vanish, camera feeds corrupt, witness statements get misplaced. Every time I got close to certain names, my supervisor would suddenly tell me to drop it. I started keeping copies at home. I started working alone. She met Ethan's eyes. That's why I was out there. Not to hurt you. To find what killed Claire. Ethan's face twisted, and for a moment the rage returned like a reflex. Then why didn't you tell me? He snarled. Megan didn't flinch. Because if Pike is dirty, she said, he has eyes everywhere, and because grief makes people do dangerous things like you did. Ethan's face tightened. The rifle sank lower. Silence spread again, broken only by the stove's crackle and the storm's distant moan. Caleb finally spoke, voice dry as old humor. In the field, he said, the scariest thing wasn't bullets. It was the guy who could wash blood off his hands and still shake yours. Ethan stared at him. Field? War, Caleb answered simply. Different uniforms, same lies. Bishop lifted his head and let out a low huff, as if offended by the mention of lies. Megan looked at Caleb, then back to Ethan. Ethan, she said softly, if I was guilty, I would have run. I wouldn't have walked into your gun, and I sure as hell wouldn't have asked you to talk about Claire. Ethan's eyes shimmered. His voice broke. I buried you, he whispered, like he was confessing to a priest made of firelight. I left you there. I thought... His throat worked, and suddenly he looked less like a killer and more like a man waking from a nightmare he'd chosen. If I'm wrong, he said hoarsely, then I tried to murder an innocent woman because Pike pointed at her. Megan's face softened, but it didn't excuse him. It understood him, which was different and somehow harder. You didn't kill me, she said quietly. You almost did, but you didn't. And that matters because it means there's still a part of you that knows the difference. Ethan's shoulders slumped. His hands shook. Then who killed her? He asked. And in that question was every broken thing he hadn't let himself feel. Megan's gaze sharpened again, purpose returning. That's what we're going to find out, she said. Caleb nodded once, a soldier accepting a mission he hadn't wanted. But we do it smart, he added. No more shovels. No more graves. Ethan stared at the stove, then slowly set the rifle down beside the crate. It wasn't surrender. It was exhaustion choosing a different direction. He looked up at Megan, eyes rimmed red, voice barely audible. I'm sorry, he said. I don't expect forgiveness. I can't keep living in this ash. Megan's lips pressed together. Her voice came out steady. Then don't, she said. Help us. Outside, the storm kept falling. pretending it could bury anything forever. Inside the lean-to, 3 people and a dog sat in a circle of firelight, and for the first time, the story shifted. It was no longer a chase. It was a reckoning, one that pointed beyond a grieving man with a shovel, toward something cleaner, colder, and far more dangerous, and, like all monsters in old tales, far better dressed. Snow kept falling, gentler now, like the forest had switched from shouting to listening, and the 3 of them moved beneath it as if walking under the gaze of old gods who loved secrets. Caleb Ward didn't like alliances. Alliances meant expectations, and expectations were how people got you killed. But he still found himself standing in Ethan Cross's lean-to at first light, tracing circles in frost on a warped plank table, while Megan Holt spoke in that steady, matter-of-fact tone that cops use to keep fear from gaining a vote. Ethan looked worse in daylight. Not more dangerous, just more human. His shoulders were still broad, but his posture sagged as if grief had finally admitted it was heavy. His beard, black threaded with gray, stuck out in uneven patches, and his eyes had the swollen redness of a man who'd tried to drink sleep and failed. He kept rubbing his thumb along a groove in his wedding band like he could sand time backward. Bishop lay near the stove with his head on his paws, amber eyes flicking from face to face, alert even while resting like a guardian carved from fur. Megan spread her evidence photos on the table, the creek bank, the replaced caution tape, the gouged stake, the unfamiliar boot tread. "It's not just Claire," she said. "It never was." She named the first accident out loud, and the air changed. "Ronan Pierce, bridge engineer, 2 years ago." Ethan's jaw tightened. Caleb watched Megan's eyes as she spoke. He'd seen that look before in soldiers reading a casualty list. Controlled, but angry underneath. Megan explained that Ronan Pierce had been 46, tall and lanky, with sandy hair that always looked windblown and a habit of joking to cover nerves. He'd overseen repairs on the old county bridge near the Forest Access Road. The official story said he fell from scaffolding during an inspection. Bad harness, bad luck. But Megan had visited the site later and found something odd. The bolts on the railing were newly replaced, shiny and clean against weathered metal, like someone had edited the scene after the fact. Ronan's wife had begged for a deeper investigation, and the request vanished into paperwork the way a stone vanished into a frozen lake. He told a colleague the bridge project was being pressured, Megan said. Budget numbers didn't match. A contractor bid was forced through. Caleb's mind clicked into the old pattern. Follow the money, find the leash. Ethan stared at the table as if the names were nails hammered into it. "Ronan was the guy who fixed my porch once," he muttered, voice rough. "He charged me in beer and insults." Megan's mouth twitched humor, brief and sad. "Yeah," she said softly. "He had that effect." Then she named the second death. Darlene Fitch, town accountant, last spring. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He knew that name too, everyone did. Darlene Fitch was one of those women who looked like she could balance your bank account with one hand while stabbing a pie crust with the other. 51, petite, always in neat sweaters, hair dyed a stubborn auburn that refused to fade even when winter tried. She smiled politely, but she watched everything. Official cause. Sudden stroke at home. Tragic, inevitable. Closed. Megan's voice lowered. 2 weeks before she died, she asked for access to the Briar Hollow Land Trust ledger, the Conservation Fund. Caleb felt the word conservation catch in his chest like a hook. Pretty words were often the ugliest knives. Ethan's face hardened. Darlene used to say, "If a number looks too clean, somebody scrubbed it," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. Megan nodded once, grateful for the confirmation. She named the third. Miles Keene, freelance reporter, disappeared in the blizzard last year. Caleb didn't know Miles personally, but he'd seen the flyers. Miles Keene's face had been printed in black and white around town, late 30s, sharp cheekbones, dark curly hair always slightly wild, eyes that looked like they were laughing at something only he understood. People called him nosy, the way they called wolves curious. Miles had been chasing a story about land deals and backroom permits. Then a storm came, and he vanished. The sheriff's office called it exposure, tragic, nature's fault. No body found. "Nature doesn't write press releases," Megan said, and there was steel in her tone now. "People do." Caleb leaned over Megan's photos and notes, tapping the unfamiliar boot tread image with a pencil. "All three touched the same thing," he said. "Land, money, permission." Megan's eyes sharpened. "Exactly," she replied. "Forest parcels, rezoning, a conservation fund, and a closed service road that keeps showing up like a recurring nightmare." Ethan swallowed hard. "Claire was checking land markers," he said. "She said something shouldn't exist." Caleb's voice turned dry as old humor. "Maybe she found the part of the world where the villains keep their receipts." Bishop lifted his head at the change in tone, then stood and walked a slow circle around the lean-to, nose working. He paused near Ethan's boots and sniffed them, then moved to the doorway and sniffed the wind, as if tasting the day. Megan watched the dog and exhaled. "I have pieces," she said, "but pieces don't arrest anyone." Caleb opened his weathered notebook. He drew a simple grid: dates, locations, names, who benefits. The old soldier in him woke up like a bear in spring, irritated but useful. "We don't talk to the sheriff," he said, and Ethan's eyes flicked up. "Why not?" Ethan asked. "Because if Pike's dirty, he's not dirty alone," Caleb replied. "And if we pick the wrong door to knock on, we give them time to move the furniture." Megan didn't argue. She looked tired, but there was a fierce clarity in her gaze, like surviving the snow had burned away everything but purpose. "Then we watch," she said. Caleb nodded. "We watch the closed service road, the one your missing GPS pings always die near. If something's moving in and out, it'll move at night, in weather like this, when honest people stay home." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know trails," he said. "Old logging cuts, unmarked. Trucks use them when they don't want headlights seen from town." He spoke with a reluctant pride, like a man admitting he still belonged to the forest. Caleb studied him. Ethan wasn't stable, not yet, but he was shifting from weapon to witness. That mattered. They moved at dusk. Megan insisted on coming despite the stiffness in her limbs. She wore her parka and a knit cap pulled low, and in the dim light her face looked both younger and older young, from the stubbornness, old from the knowledge that the system could be corrupted by smiles. Caleb wore his leather jacket over the red and black plaid, the same armor he always carried, and he kept his movements economical, no wasted motion. Ethan led them off the main trail onto a narrow cut between pines, stepping with the confidence of a man who'd walked these woods since childhood. Bishop ranged ahead, nose down, occasionally looking back to make sure they followed, like a four-legged compass that believed in destiny. The forest grew denser, darker. Snow muffled their boots. Somewhere an owl called once, short and judgmental, then went quiet. They reached a ridge overlooking the closed service road. Below, the road was a pale scar through the trees, half buried, guarded by a locked metal gate that looked official enough to satisfy tourists and flimsy enough to insult criminals. Caleb crouched behind a fallen log, motioned the others down, and they waited. Waiting was where Caleb's mind became most dangerous. In the quiet, old memories tried to crawl in. He felt them at the edges. Distant explosions, radios cutting out, people he couldn't pull back from the dark. He forced his focus onto the road, onto the snow, onto the present. Megan sat beside him, shoulders tight, eyes scanning. Ethan paced once, then settled, gripping his knees. Bishop lay with his chin on his paws, ears twitching, listening to frequencies humans didn't have. Hours passed, stitched together by cold. Then, near midnight, a low vibration rolled through the ridge and engine, muffled by snow. Caleb's spine straightened. Megan's eyes narrowed. Ethan's breath hitched like he'd been punched. Headlights appeared, dimmed, carefully angled downward. A heavy truck crept along the service road, slow and deliberate, tires chained. It stopped near the gate. A second vehicle, smaller, followed, an SUV with tinted windows. "That's not town maintenance," Megan whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He was counting movements, exits, habits. Two men got out of the truck, bulky winter coats, faces hidden by hoods. One man stepped from the SUV with the kind of posture that didn't belong to labor, upright, confident, hands clean even in gloves. He moved like someone used to being obeyed. Caleb couldn't see his face clearly, but he saw the silhouette and felt a familiar disgust. Not fear. Disgust. Ethan's fist clenched. "They're going in," he whispered. The men unlocked the gate with a key. Not bolt cutters, a key. The gate swung open as politely as a door at City Hall. Megan's jaw tightened. "Permission," she breathed. "They have permission." The vehicles passed through and turned off down a side path Ethan recognized. "That goes toward the old storage lots," Ethan said. "Abandoned sheds from the logging days." Caleb glanced at Megan. "We don't chase blind," he murmured. "We flank." Ethan nodded and led them along an old trail that paralleled the road. The snow deepened, tugging at their boots like the forest wanted to slow them down. They moved anyway. Bishop's nose lifted, then lowered, then lifted again, conflicted. He stopped suddenly and began sniffing the air, head swinging. Then he trotted to a low depression in the snow and started pawing. Caleb crouched, brushed away powder, and caught the smell before he saw anything. Oil and something sharp, chemical clean. "Bleach," Megan whispered, her face tightening. "Why would anyone bring bleach into the woods?" Ethan swallowed. "To erase," he said, voice rough. Bishop dug faster, and the snow collapsed into a shallow pit, recently covered. Caleb pulled out his small shovel and dug carefully. Under a thin layer of packed snow and dirt, there was a bundle wrapped in plastic. He cut it open. Inside were burned items, the shattered remains of a micro SD card, warped by heat, a torn piece of dark uniform fabric with reflective striping too official to be random, and nestled among ash like a cruel little relic, a woman's ring. Silver, simple, with a single engraved letter on the inner band, C. Ethan's breath stopped. His face went slack for half a second, then twisted as grief punched through every rib at once. He reached for the ring with shaking fingers like it might bite him. "Claire," he whispered. And it wasn't a name now. It was a prayer and a wound. Megan's eyes shone, but she didn't touch him. She gave him that small mercy of space. Caleb felt anger rise again, hot and clean. Someone had buried evidence the way they tried to bury people under snow, under silence, under accident. But Bishop had found it. A dog with no interest in politics, only truth you could smell. Ethan's shoulders shook. He didn't collapse this time. He swallowed hard, closed his fist around the ring, and forced himself upright like a pine refusing to break even when the storm leaned its full weight against it. "Enough," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "No more graves." Caleb nodded once. Megan's gaze hardened into something bright and dangerous. "We document everything," she said. "Photos, bag it, chain of custody our own." Caleb looked at the dark road below, where the vehicles had disappeared into the forest like secrets on wheels. "And then," he said, voice low, "we learn who owns the key." Bishop stood at their side, snow clinging to his muzzle, eyes steady as a lighthouse. The night kept its silence, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a room right before the lights turn on. Night returned like a judge wearing a hood, and the forest held its breath as Caleb, Megan, Ethan, and Bishop moved along the ridge where the buried relics still lay open in their minds. Caleb sealed the ring and the charred fragments into a plastic bag with careful, almost reverent hands. He didn't have lab gloves or an evidence locker-only discipline, and a stubborn belief that truth deserved clean handling even when the world didn't. Megan photographed every angle, time-stamped the images, then tucked her phone deep inside her jacket to keep the battery from dying in the cold. Ethan said nothing, but his eyes had changed. Grief was still there, but now it had Edge's purpose cutting through ash. Bishop sniffed the air again, head turning, then took a few quick steps downhill, stopping to glance back as if asking, "Are we doing this or not?" Caleb exhaled once. "We follow," he said, "but we don't get seen." They tracked the vehicles by sound and patience more than sight. The snow had softened the forest, muffling engines, swallowing footprints, but it couldn't fully hide the smear of tire tracks where chains had bitten into slush. Ethan led them through an old cut that paralleled the service road, a route only locals and liars used. Megan's breath still rasped when she pushed too hard, but she kept pace, jaw tight, refusing to be the weak link. Caleb stayed slightly ahead, reading the terrain like a map etched into his muscles. Bishop moved at the front, leash slack most of the time, his thick coat picking up snow like a moving drift. Twice he paused, nose twitching, then pulled them into the shadow of pines just as distant headlights slid across the road below. The vehicles reappeared near Midnight Truck first, then the SUV slow, deliberate, as if they knew no one would challenge them. They turned off the service road and vanished behind a screen of trees. "Storage lots," Ethan whispered. "Old timber depot." He didn't need to say more. The forest did the rest, funneling them into a low valley where an industrial shape squatted behind the pines like a secret too heavy to carry. A warehouse. Corrugated metal walls dulled by rust. One side half hidden by a berm of snow and old equipment abandoned loaders, dented barrels, a broken sign that once had a company name and now only had a ghost of letters. A thin line of light escaped from a slit in the structure, weak but steady. Caleb crouched behind a fallen log and raised his binoculars. The gate they'd seen earlier had led here. This wasn't conservation. This was a throat, and something was being fed. Megan's eyes narrowed. "There's power," she murmured, pointing to a thick cable snaking into the building. "Generator or tied into a line. Either way, they're running operations." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "Claire said something shouldn't exist," he whispered. "This is what she meant." Caleb watched the entrance. Men moved in and out. No drunken thugs, no sloppy criminals. These men had posture, organization, boots that didn't slip. Two of them wore dark jackets with reflective patches, and one flashed a badge-shaped emblem when he checked the door. It might have been security. It might have been law enforcement. Either way, it was the kind of symbol that made ordinary citizens step back. Bishop stiffened and gave a low, warning huff. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Quiet," he mouthed. They waited until the truck's rear doors opened. Inside were sealed boxes, paper boxes, not weapons crates. Megan's jaw tightened. "Documents," she whispered. "Evidence." Ethan's eyes burned. "They're moving the proof." Caleb's mind ran through risk like a math problem. 3 humans, 1 dog, a warehouse full of unknowns. "In and out," he said. "We're not here to fight. We're here to see." Megan nodded, then pointed toward a narrow service door on the building's side, half blocked by a snowbank. "If there's a records room," she said, "it'll be away from the loading bay. That door looks like staff access." Ethan looked at her, skepticism flickering. "How do you know?" Megan's mouth tightened. "Because I've seen how towns hide things. They don't lock them behind dragons. They lock them behind employees only." Caleb gave a humorless half-smile. Modern magic words. They moved in a slow arc, staying in shadows, timing their steps with the wind gusts that rattled the metal walls. Caleb's leather jacket creaked once and he froze, body going still until the sound was swallowed by a moaning gust. Bishop's paws placed themselves with uncanny quiet. Ethan, built for hauling logs, moved with surprising care, as if the woods had taught him stealth between grief attacks. Megan followed last, her gaze sharp, breath controlled. At the side door, Caleb tested the handle. Locked. He glanced at Ethan. Ethan pulled a small set of keys from his pocket-old habits of a man who'd worked too many sites. He selected a thin pick tool, slid it in, and worked the lock with trembling precision. "You can do that?" Megan whispered. Ethan's eyes stayed on the lock. "When you've been broke," he muttered, "you learn a lot of skills the town doesn't put on flyers." The door clicked open. Inside, the air was colder than the cabin, but not as cold as outside industrial cold, stale and metallic, layered with the sharp sting of chemicals, bleach, solvent, paper dust. Caleb's nostrils flared. "They clean," he murmured. "After everything." Megan's face hardened. Bishop's ears pricked forward, and his nose worked like a living sensor sweeping the dark. They moved down a narrow corridor lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with a sickly buzz. Shadows jumped on the walls. The place smelled like secrets left too long in a drawer. They reached a room with a half-open door. Inside, metal shelves held boxes of files and binders. A printer sat on a table, its tray stacked with fresh paperwork. Megan's throat tightened. "This is it," she whispered. Caleb motioned for her to photograph first. No touching until they documented. Megan stepped in, raising her phone, its camera lens catching the glow of the fluorescence. She snapped 1, 2, 3 photos. Then her face went pale again, not from cold this time. "Caleb," she whispered, voice cracking. He stepped closer and saw what she saw, an autopsy report with tampered lines, numbers scratched out and rewritten, signatures that looked practiced, a map of forest parcels with boundaries redrawn in ink, a ledger labeled Briar Hollow Conservation Trust donations, disbursements, and a column that didn't belong, transfers. Megan flipped to another page, and another. Her hands began to shake. On the bottom corner of multiple forms was a signature, Megan Holt. Her name written in a slightly wrong slant, like someone imitating her handwriting after watching her sign a coffee receipt. She stared, eyes wide, fury and disbelief colliding. "I never signed these," she breathed. Caleb felt something cold move through his spine. This wasn't just corruption. This was identity theft weaponized into a noose. Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts. He reached for a folder labeled Incident Cross, Claire. Megan caught his wrist, gentle but firm. "Photos first," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard, then nodded, eyes glossy with rage. Megan photographed the folder label, then the first page inside, a grainy printed still of Claire near the creek. Another page, a report describing accidental slip. Another, a list of witnesses who hadn't actually been there. And then, tucked between pages like a confession someone forgot to burn, a photocopy of a memory card label M, Keen Archive. Ethan's throat made a strangled sound. "Miles," he whispered. "They had his work." Caleb's voice came out low. "And they killed him for it." Megan's eyes narrowed at a set of documents stamped with a county seal. "They altered autopsies," she murmured. "Look at the coroner's notes, ink color changes mid-sentence." Caleb leaned over, reading. The name at the bottom turned his stomach. Dr. Leonard Voss, county medical examiner. He'd seen Voss at town events, tall, thin, with a narrow face and a mustache trimmed too neatly, a man whose smile always seemed slightly delayed, as if he had to remember what emotions looked like. Caleb had always thought Voss looked like a man who preferred bodies to living people because corpses didn't argue. "They forged his signature," Megan said, "or he did it himself." Ethan's eyes flashed. "Claire found this," he said hoarsely. "That's why she called me." Caleb's gaze lifted from the paperwork, and for a moment he saw the whole machine. Pike's honeyed voice, Voss's tidy pen, the gate key turning smoothly, the trucks moving boxes of records through the snow. "They don't kill for greed," Caleb said, and the words tasted like ash. "They kill because it's routine, a habit, like brushing teeth." Megan's face tightened with disgust. "They've been labeling murder as weather," she whispered. Bishop suddenly stiffened. His ears snapped toward the corridor. A faint sound. Footsteps. Not the heavy stomp of a worker. Controlled steps. Multiple. Caleb killed the phone's flashlight with a tap and motioned them back into shadow between shelves. Ethan's hand twitched toward a metal pipe leaning against the wall, but Caleb caught his wrist. "No," Caleb mouthed. "Not yet." The footsteps drew closer. Light spilled under the door as it opened wider. Two men entered first, both broad, wearing insulated jackets with official-looking patches and lanyards with access cards. Their faces were partially covered by gaiters, but Caleb could see the clean-shaven jaw lines, the disciplined, scanning gaze. Behind them came a third figure, the man from the SUV. He stepped into the room without hurry, as if he owned not just the building, but the air inside it. He was in his 50s, tall, shoulders squared beneath a tailored winter coat, hair silver at the temples and combed neatly back. His face was handsome in a polished way, sharp nose, thin lips, eyes that didn't crinkle when he smiled. Harold Pike. Up close, his kindness looked like a mask carved from ice. Pike's gaze moved across the shelves and landed on the open folder Megan had just photographed. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes sharpened. "Someone's been in here," he said softly, voice smooth as warm syrup. One of the lanyard men stepped forward. "Door was locked," he replied. Pike's smile remained. "Locks are for honest people," he said. Then, as if the building itself had whispered to him, his head turned slightly toward the exact shelf where Caleb, Megan, Ethan, and Bishop held their breath in darkness. Pike's eyes narrowed. His voice dropped, gentle and deadly. "Come out," he said. "I know you're here." In that moment, the myth became real. The false gods had sensed the mortals touching their altar, and the punishment was already walking toward them, wearing badges and access cards instead of horns. The warehouse air still clung to them when they slipped back into the storm bleach and paper dust, the scent of a town trying to wash its sins in cold water. Caleb moved first, pulling Megan and Ethan through the service corridor like a man who'd learned that survival was mostly timing. Bishop padded at Caleb's heel, silent as a curse. Behind them, Harold Pike's voice had been smooth and certain. "Come out. I know you're here." As if truth were a pet he could call by name. Caleb didn't give him the satisfaction. He killed the overhead hum by closing the door softly, and they disappeared into the woods the way the forest swallowed footprints. Quickly, completely, without applause. They ran until the warehouse light was only a smear behind trees, then slowed to a crouching pace, breath steaming, hearts hammering. Megan's hands shook, not from cold now, but from fury. Ethan's face looked carved out of guilt and rage, his fist still closed around Claire's ring like a talisman that kept him from dissolving. Bishop stopped once, ears snapping back, listening. A vehicle engine started in the distance. Men shouted muffled orders. Pike was mobilizing. "They know," Megan whispered. Caleb's jaw set. "They suspect," he corrected. "Knowing needs proof. Let's not give it to them." They didn't return to Ethan's lean-to. Too obvious, too close. Caleb led them to his cabin by a long, looping trail that broke every pattern a pursuer would expect. When the amber porch light finally appeared through the pines, it felt less like home and more like a war room disguised as wood. Inside, the stove heat hit them with a dull comfort, and for a moment the myth of safety tried to settle over their shoulders. Megan didn't let it. She peeled off her gloves, paced once, then planted herself at the table, eyes burning. "We can't take this to the station," she said. "Pike has keys and access cards. He has men. He has my forged signature. If we march in with our photos, he'll call it fabrication and arrest me for tampering." Ethan's voice was low. "He'll say I'm unstable," he muttered. "Grieving husband, violent, unreliable." Caleb stared at the wall as if he could see the whole town behind it. "He'll say I'm a drifter," Caleb added. "Dry. Unknown. Convenient scapegoat." Bishop lay near the stove, but his head was up, watching, like he understood that the pack was deciding whether to bite or outthink. Megan took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and you decide not to jump. "Then we don't fight him in his courtroom," she said. "We build our own." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Megan leaned forward. The firelight caught the sharp planes of her face, strong nose, stubborn jaw, tired eyes that had refused to shut even when she'd been buried. "We bait them," she said simply. Ethan's shoulders tensed. "With what?" Megan's lips pressed together. "With something they can't resist," she replied. "A new piece of evidence. Something that makes them show up personally. Something that makes them talk." Caleb exhaled, skeptical. "They'll come with a gun, Megan." "Then we pick where the gun is useless," Megan answered. Caleb paused. That was the first sentence that sounded like his language. Megan reached into her pocket and pulled out a small body-worn camera, scuffed, outdated, not currently registered. "I kept this off the books," she said. "It's illegal for them to take from me without a warrant if the system was clean, but it's not, so we do it differently." She set the camera down like a chess piece. "We record a confession." Ethan's throat worked. "They won't confess." Megan's eyes sharpened. "They will if they think they're closing a loose end," she said. Caleb's mind started building angles approach, concealment, sound carry in snow, sight lines. The soldier in him didn't want to wake up, but it did anyway, irritated and precise. "What's the bait?" Caleb asked. Ethan opened his fist and let Claire's ring glint in the firelight. His voice cracked. "She had something," he said. "Before she died, she said she'd show me." Megan nodded. "We make them believe she left a copy Miles Keene's archive, a digital dump, a memory card that survived." Caleb's brow tightened. "We already saw the card label in the folder," he said. "They think they destroyed it." Megan's gaze held his. "Exactly," she said. "So we create a new one, a fake backup that looks just real enough to panic them." Ethan's face hardened. "And I'm the messenger," he said, understanding settling over him like armor. Megan nodded once. "You play the desperate man," she said. "You tell Pike you found something Claire hid. You say you're tired. You want peace. You'll trade it for cash and a promise they'll stop circling your life." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He'll come," he whispered. "He'll come to make sure I'm quiet forever." Caleb's voice was flat. "Then we don't give him privacy." They built the plan in short, rhythmic steps. No wasted speeches, only the necessary. Caleb mapped the terrain, the clearing where Megan had been buried, a wide stretch of snow bordered by pines like dark teeth. The openness made it dangerous, but it also made it honest. No corners for them to hide behind, only the truth and whoever came to smother it. "We'll use the wind," Caleb said, tapping the map he'd drawn. "It covers sound. It hides movement. We set our withdrawal route through the ravine line, here packed snow, but trees for cover." Megan listened, eyes following his finger. "You think like a battlefield," she murmured. Caleb's mouth twisted. "The forest is a battlefield," he replied. "People just pretend it isn't." Ethan sat rigid, fists clenched, absorbing every detail. He was big, but he looked smaller now, like a man who'd been carrying a boulder and finally realized it wasn't his to carry alone. "What about the dog?" Ethan asked, glancing at Bishop. Bishop's ears flicked. Megan's expression softened slightly. "He becomes our signal," she said. Caleb's eyebrows rose. "He's not a remote control." Megan shook her head. "No," she said. "He's smarter than that. We train a simple cue." She looked at Bishop, then at Caleb. "One short bark means danger abort. 2 short barks means we have enough end it." Caleb stared, then nodded slowly. He didn't like relying on anything unpredictable, but Bishop wasn't unpredictable. Bishop was the most honest creature in the room. They rehearsed the cues with quiet commands and treats Ethan had in his pack. Bishop learned fast, eyes bright, tail low but steady, as if he understood that this game wasn't for food, it was for lives. Megan prepared the fake evidence. She copied innocuous files onto a small micro SD card, then printed labels that mimicked the ones from the warehouse folder M. Keene Archive Backup. She also slipped in one real thing, a photograph she'd taken of Pike inside the warehouse, time-stamped, undeniable. "If they seize it," she said, "it still burns them." Caleb watched her work and felt reluctant respect. She wasn't just brave, she was careful. That was rarer. Ethan practiced his lines, voice trembling at first, then steadier as he leaned into the role of broken man selling the last piece of his wife for survival. The humor of it was cruel. He didn't have to act much. He only had to aim his pain in the right direction. They chose the meeting time, midnight, when town officials liked to believe the world belonged to them. Ethan would call Pike from a burner phone Megan had kept for her off-book investigation. Caleb would be in the tree line with binoculars and a clear line of retreat, leather jacket blending into bark and shadow. Megan would be closer, hidden behind a low drift with the camera angled toward the meeting spot. Mike sheltered from wind. Bishop would lie between her and the open snow like a living shield, ready to bark the signal. The place they picked was where Megan had almost died. The empty snowfield, wind whistling like death's cheap flute, the ground hard and packed from last night's struggle. Returning there felt like stepping back into a grave to retrieve your name. Megan didn't flinch. "It's poetic," Ethan muttered bitterly as they approached the clearing. "The place he tried to bury you becomes where we bury them." Megan's voice was quiet. "We're not burying anyone," she said. "We're exposing." Caleb watched the tree line, counting shadows. He didn't believe in poetry. He believed in outcomes. Ethan stood alone in the center of the clearing, shoulders hunched, hands visible, the tiny memory card taped inside a small plastic bag hanging from his fingers like a lure. Snow drifted across his boots. He looked exactly like the kind of man Pike would assume he could buy. Minutes passed. The forest held its breath. Then headlights cut through the pines. 2 vehicles this time, slow and confident. One was the familiar SUV. The other was a county-issued truck with a light bar on top, lights off. But the silhouette screamed authority. The truck stopped. The SUV stopped. Doors opened. Harold Pike stepped out first. Tall and polished even in winter, silver at the temples, tailored coat buttoned, gloves spotless. His smile arrived a heartbeat after his eyes, practiced and warm as honey, but his gaze was cold enough to freeze it. Beside him emerged a larger man with the heavy stance of someone who'd worn power like a belt for decades. Sheriff Vernon Hale, 55, thick through the chest, salt and pepper hair cut short, a trimmed gray beard that framed a mouth used to giving orders. His cheeks were ruddy from cold, his eyes small and assessing, and when he smiled, it looked like a warning disguised as friendliness. He wore a sheriff's jacket with the county patch, and his hand rested casually near his holstered sidearm, the way some men rested a hand on a table to remind you who owned the room. 2 deputies lingered behind them. Young men, average build, faces tense, clearly following orders rather than understanding them. Pike's voice floated across the snow. "Ethan," he called, warm as a pastor. "You said you found something." Ethan swallowed, then lifted the bag. "Claire left it," he said, voice rough, selling desperation. "A backup, Miles Keene. It has everything." Pike's eyes sharpened. Sheriff Hale's gaze flicked to the bag, then to the tree line, scanning like a predator. Megan's heart hammered as she watched through her drift, camera recording, Bishop's body pressed against her leg. Caleb was out there too, unseen, a phantom with a plan. Pike stepped closer, boots crunching. "You understand what you're holding is dangerous," Pike said, and the softness in his tone began to thin. Ethan's hands trembled, but he held the bait steady. "I want money," Ethan said, "and I want you to leave me alone." Pike smiled wider. "Of course," he murmured. "We've always wanted peace for you." Sheriff Hale's voice cut in, lower, harsher. "Hand it over, Ethan. Let's not make this a scene." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "A scene?" he echoed, and anger flickered, real anger now, not acting. "Like the scenes you kept calling accidents?" For a fraction of a second, Pike's smile faltered. Then he recovered. "Careful," Pike said softly. "Words can get you hurt." Megan felt Bishop tense. The dog let out one short bark-sharp warning. Caleb, in the tree line, would hear it. "Abort," it said. "Danger." But Megan kept filming. She watched as Pike's honey voice darkened into something else, mud rising to the surface. "You don't know what you're talking about," Pike said, but his eyes did not deny it. Sheriff Hale stepped forward, and the air changed the way air changed when men decided the law was a costume, not a duty. "This ends tonight," Hale said, and his hand drifted closer to his holster. In that moment, the trap tightened. Pike and Hale thought they were closing a loose end. They didn't know the snow was listening, the camera was watching, and the veteran in the trees had already chosen where the shadows would bite back. The clearing had the hush of a cathedral built from snow. Wind slid across the open field in long, whistling breaths, combing the drifts into pale waves. Above, the pines stood like black-robed witnesses, their branches heavy with ice, their silence old enough to feel mythic. Ethan Cross held the plastic bag in his trembling hand, the fake archive dangling like a small, shiny lie meant to catch a larger truth. Harold Pike stood a few steps away, perfectly composed in his tailored coat, silver hair slicked neatly back, gloves spotless, smile warm as honey and just as sticky. Sheriff Vernon Hale hovered beside him, broad as a barn door, salt and pepper hair cropped close, trimmed gray beard framing a mouth used to giving orders. Two deputies lingered behind, young and tense, eyes darting between the men who wore authority like armor and the lone logger who looked like he'd finally decided to stop being afraid of them. Hidden behind a low snowbank, Megan Holt lay still with the camera rolling, her breath carefully controlled so her lungs wouldn't betray her. Her cheeks were raw from cold, and her dark hair was tucked under a knit cap, but her eyes were razor bright. Bishop pressed against her leg, thick black and tan coat dusted white, body warm and steady, ears forward like twin blades. Farther out in the tree line, Caleb Ward watched through binoculars, the worn brown leather jacket blending into bark and shadow, the red and black plaid beneath it barely visible. His face was calm, in a way that didn't mean he wasn't afraid. It meant he'd learned how to function with fear-riding shotgun. Pike stepped closer, boots crunching softly. "You're doing the right thing, Ethan," he said, tone gentle, like a man soothing a child, not cornering a grieving husband. "Hand it over. We'll make sure you're taken care of." Ethan's jaw tightened. He felt Claire's ring in his pocket like a coal that refused to cool. "Taken care of," Ethan echoed, and the words tasted like rot. Sheriff Hale shifted his weight, eyes narrowing at the bag. "Don't get poetic," Hale said, voice low, impatient. "You want money? Fine. You want to walk away? Then walk. But give it to us." Ethan's lips parted, and for a second he looked like he might break. Then he surprised them. He didn't step forward. He stepped back just one pace, forcing Pike and Hale to advance if they wanted the bag. Pike's eyes flicked toward the tree line measuring, calculating. "You're stalling," Pike murmured, the warmth thinning from his voice. Ethan lifted his chin. "I'm thinking," he said, "something I should have done before I put a woman in the ground." The deputies exchanged a glance. One of them, a young man with a pale face and a narrow nose, swallowed hard like he was suddenly aware this wasn't a routine call. Pike's smile returned, wider, sharper. "Careful," he said softly. "Regret makes men irrational." Ethan's eyes burned. "And power makes men lazy," he shot back. Pike's gaze snapped to the bag again. "Give it to me," he said, and now the voice wasn't honey, it was command. Sheriff Hale took a step forward, hand drifting toward his holster, posture tightening into threat. The moment sharpened. Megan's heart hammered. She glanced at Bishop, then toward the tree line where Caleb waited. They needed Pike and Hale to talk more, to spill more mud enough that even a polished town couldn't scrub it clean. But they also needed to stay alive long enough to use it. Ethan's hand trembled. He raised the bag slightly, making them lean in. "I want to know something first," Ethan said, voice rough. "Why Claire?" Pike's face didn't change, but his eyes did, an almost invisible tightening, like a curtain drawn. "Your wife was a good person," Pike said smoothly. "Tragedies happen." Ethan laughed once short, ugly. "Don't," he said. "Don't turn murder into weather." Sheriff Hale's mouth curled. "Watch your mouth," he warned. Ethan's voice rose just a notch. "You called it an accident. You called Ronan's death a fall. You called Darlene's stroke unfortunate. You called Miles a lost hiker. He jabbed a finger into the snow. You didn't just kill people. You renamed it. Pike's smile finally faltered. You don't have proof, he said, but he sounded less sure than before. Ethan lifted the bag higher. I do, he lied, and the lie was bait with teeth. Pike's eyes flashed. Hale's patience snapped. Enough, Hale growled, stepping in. Hand it over, now. Megan saw it, the second before violence. She moved her thumb to the transmitter switch beneath her glove, the one tied to Caleb's contingency plan. The signal wasn't flashy. It was a whisper sent through the dark. Then she looked at Bishop and gave the quiet cue they'd practiced. The dog rose, muscles coiling, and the sound that came from him was clean and sharp. One short bark, cutting the night like a blade. Pike's head snapped toward the snowbank. Hale's eyes widened. What was that? One deputy blurted, voice cracking. The clearing erupted in motion. From the tree line, a beam of white light swept across the snow. Then another, headlamps and floodlights snapping on in staggered rhythm, revealing shapes moving fast and coordinated. Caleb stepped out first, not charging, not shouting, just appearing like winter had conjured him. His posture was controlled, hands visible, voice carrying without strain. Sheriff Hale, he called. Step away from Ethan, now! Hale's face twisted in shock and fury. Who the hell are you? He barked, but his hand froze near his holster. Pike's expression hardened into a mask of indignation. This is an unlawful interference, Pike announced loudly, as if volume could rewrite reality. Then the real cavalry arrived, not a posse of locals, but a line of men and women in dark winter gear, disciplined and careful, moving like professionals who had done this in worse places. The first to step forward was a woman with a slate-gray beanie and a calm face, mid-40s, athletic build, cheeks weathered by cold. Her eyes were steady, the kind you trusted before you knew why. She flashed a badge and spoke with crisp authority. Agent Tessa Lang, State Bureau of Investigation, she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. We have a warrant for Harold Pike, Sheriff Vernon Hale, and any associates involved in evidence tampering, obstruction, and homicide investigations. 2 more agents fanned out, weapons drawn but low, controlled. One was a tall black man with close-cropped hair and a scar along his eyebrow, early 40s, expression unreadable. Agent Marcus Reed, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't bluff. The other was shorter, stockier, pale-skinned, with a red beard and a jaw like a shovel agent Cole Branson, eyes sharp, scanning for exits. Pike's face flickered between outrage and calculation. "This is ridiculous," he said, voice strained. "You can't—" Megan stood up from behind the snowbank, knees stiff, camera still running. She looked like she'd climbed out of her own grave and decided to bring receipts. "I can," she said clearly, "because I documented it." Pike's eyes narrowed at her. "Officer Holt," he said, tone turning paternal, "you're confused. You've been through trauma." Megan's mouth tightened. "Yes," she replied, "and the trauma didn't make me hallucinate your forged paperwork." She held up her phone and the body cam unit. "You used my name like a stamp. You changed reports. You moved money through a conservation fund. You destroyed evidence and tried to bury people literally." Hale's face turned a dangerous shade of red. "You don't have jurisdiction," he snapped at Agent Lang. Agent Lang didn't flinch. "We do," she replied. "And we also have recorded audio of you threatening a citizen to hand over evidence." She nodded at Megan's camera. "Plus whatever else you said tonight while thinking you were untouchable." Pike's smile tried to return, but it looked like a crack in porcelain. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted, voice smoothening again, trying to wrap the moment in politeness. "We were simply retrieving—" Ethan stepped forward then, and for the first time since Claire died, he looked taller than his grief. The hatred in his eyes wasn't there anymore. What replaced it was hotter and cleaner. A wake fire. "My wife didn't die in a storm," Ethan said, voice shaking but strong. "She died because she saw you." Pike's eyes flashed. "You're grieving," Pike said sharply. "You're unstable." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out Claire's ring. He held it up like a small moon. "She kept lists," he said, and his voice broke, but he didn't stop. "She believed writing things down made them harder to erase." He looked directly at Pike. "And you erased her anyway." Sheriff Hale's hand finally twitched toward his holster. Agent Reed moved in a blur-controlled speed-closing distance and pinning Hale's wrist before the gun could clear leather. "Don't," Agent Reed said quietly. Hale froze, breathing hard, ego and fear wrestling in his chest. Agent Lang signaled, and 2 agents stepped in to cuff him. Pike lifted his hand slowly, not because he was surrendering, but because he'd realized cameras and warrants were sunlight and his snow was melting. "This town needs stability," Pike said, grasping at the last story he could sell. Megan's eyes held him. "This town needs truth," she answered. Bishop let out a second bark, then another 2 short barks in sequence, the signal they'd trained for, enough evidence gathered. Megan didn't smile, but something inside her eased, like a knot loosening after months of tension. Caleb stepped closer to Ethan, placing a steady hand on the man's shoulder. No speech, just weight and presence. Ethan's breathing stuttered. He stared at Pike as officers secured him, and the satisfaction he expected didn't arrive. What arrived was relief so sharp it almost hurt. Megan turned to Ethan, voice softer now, strange and honest. "You almost became their tool," she said, "but you came back." Ethan's eyes filled. "I tried to kill you," he whispered. Megan nodded once. "And you chose not to finish it," she replied. "That choice is the only reason we're standing here instead of burying more names." The agents escorted Pike and Hale toward the vehicles. The deputies looked stunned, faces pale, like they'd just learned the uniform didn't guarantee purity. Snow kept falling, indifferent, but the clearing felt lighter, as if the forest itself had been holding a secret in its lungs and finally exhaled. Later, the town would roar with news. Investigations would reopen. Ronan Pierce's fall would be re-examined. Darlene Fitch's stroke would be scrutinized. The disappearance of Miles Keene would be treated as a crime scene, not a bedtime story. The county medical examiner's records would be audited. The conservation fund would be torn open like a rotten log revealing insects. Briar Hollow would learn that accident had been a label slapped over murder to make it easier to swallow. But here, in the snowfield, the myth ended in a quieter way. Caleb returned to his cabin before dawn, the world still gray-blue, his boots leaving a trail that the storm tried to erase. Inside, he hung his worn brown leather jacket on its hook with a slow, careful motion, like placing armor back on a shrine. Bishop sat, tail thumping once against the floor, eyes bright with exhaustion and pride. Caleb crouched and pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's head. "Good work," he murmured, voice rough, and Bishop leaned into him, warm and alive, guardian and friend. Megan didn't go back to being alone either. She stood on her porch later with hot coffee in both hands, breath steaming, bruises still healing, and she looked out at the forest not as an enemy, but as a witness that had finally been heard. Ethan, for the first time in a year, slept without whiskey. Not because he'd been forgiven by the world, but because he'd forgiven himself enough to keep living. In old stories, truth was a buried sword that only the brave could pull free. In Briar Hollow, truth had been buried too under snow, under signatures, under accidents. It hadn't died. It had waited. And when it rose, it did what truth always does. It turned powerful men into ordinary men again, and it turned ordinary people into something quietly legendary. In the end, Briar Hollow learned what winter tries to hide. Miracles rarely arrive with trumpets. They come like a warm breath under a frozen door, like a faithful heart that refuses to quit, like a single choice made in fear that still leans toward mercy. If God can lift life out of snow, He can lift hope out of ordinary days too, out of a tired morning, a lonely kitchen, a doctor's waiting room, a job that feels too heavy. Sometimes the miracle isn't the storm stopping. Sometimes it's that someone keeps walking anyway, and God places a hand quiet and unseen on the next step. So tonight, wherever someone is watching from, let this be the reminder: the truth can be buried, but it does not die. Love can be bruised, but it can grow back stronger. And when the world feels cold, God still sends small lights, one brave soul, one loyal friend, one faithful dog, one second chance enough to guide a life home. If this story stirred something in the heart, leave a comment and share where someone is watching from. Let the world feel less lonely for a moment. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with a friend who needs hope today. And may God bless every viewer and every home. May He protect the weary, heal the broken, and place peace over their nights like a blanket of gentle snow. Amen.